This story begins at the home where Mike Jengzi lives. At this point, the guy has no idea that in just a few minutes, he would see something that would change his life forever. Mike Jengzi was an ordinary university student and lived a very ordinary life, until a month ago, when a guy heard some strange voices in the library. And as soon as he got in there, one book caught his eye that seemed to emanate fire and some kind of inexplicable energy. It stood out from the rest with its incredible red glow and uniqueness. Of course, the guy got really curious, so he opened this book called Urban Legends. And from that moment on, his life will never be the same again. Just a few seconds later, Mike found himself in this world and became a student at Jean High School. His New World parents died in a plane crash, leaving an inheritance and an insurance settlement, thus relieving him of any worries or problems in that regard. But that's not even the most interesting part, because in his past life, the guy opened and read the contents of the book. Because of this, his life was shortened to 30 days. Unfortunately, Mike had no idea what the consequences of his curiosity would be. And also, from this day forward, he must live by the rules and everything written in the book. He has new rules, assignments, and more. It's interesting to get his opinion on whether the guy would have opened that book if he knew where it would lead to. Anyway, it doesn't matter anymore, according to the rules, and I need to record urban legends and get good and evil points, so he would have the opportunity to extend his life. Mike researched this book and noticed that as soon as he wrote down some legend, it would immediately come to life. And the first legend he recorded was of a daughter and mother who lived in the neighborhood and were cruelly destroyed. It turns out that if someone sees this legend or the picture next to it, the same situation will happen in the family of this person, which is depicted in the picture or in the text. And from every crevice the eye looked at the villain. The eye could look at a person from any crevice, altering his consciousness, bringing him to unconsciousness and even self-destruction. Thus, many people who did not know that by looking at the picture or by reading the legend, they were doomed to the same thing. They just died, and for a long time no one could figure out why. But the amazing thing is that everyone sees the red eye in front of them before they die. Unfortunately, in order to survive and prolong his life, Mike has no choice but to make up these horrible legends, and preferably do it in such a way that as many people as possible will want to read or see it. A month later at this point, the guy was able to increase his life expectancy to 92 days. But that result doesn't suit him at all. So all he's interested in right now is increasing those numbers despite the horrible way he's earning them. Anyway, he really has no other choice, so he chooses his life and makes the best of it, so that the number of days left doesn't reach 0. High school, Jiang City, grade K. All lessons were over and it was time to go home. But before going home, the girls noticed that their classmate had fallen asleep and did not wake up. They decided to wake him up and let him know it was safe to go home. For his classmates, this situation was just an excuse to make fun of him. But they have no idea. What's the reason for this guy's tiredness? It's because he was up till 4 in the morning making up a new story, so he didn't get any sleep at all. Before going home, he was offered to go to the Ghost Society, but it turned out that he was not interested in it at all, as everyone there was idle or playing computer games. So Mike Jengzi sent a message not to be expected today. And as soon as he sent that message, it immediately caused a lot of outrage. But for some reason, the kid can't tell them the reason he's sleep-deprived and doesn't want to stay after school. When suddenly on his way home, Mike Jengzi heard some noise, and in some guy's voice. It became obvious to him that someone needed help. Some company started threatening his classmate. They are very aggressive towards him, and it seems like they are going to beat him up and punish him for something. Mike Jengzi didn't want to stay away and didn't ignore such an injustice. He asked if it wasn't shameful for them to attack 5 against 1. Those words were very surprising, and an equally strong desire to show that it's none of his business. And it turns out they'd never met him or spoken to him before. As suddenly, one of them recognized this guy and told his buddies his name. Just in a second, they were no longer so sure and wanted to run away before it was too late. Through the story of one of them, these villains learn that Mike Jengzi is a guy you'd better not get into conflict with, because you could risk your life. After a while, they still haven't decided how best to handle the situation so as not to ruin their credibility. Then, Mike Jengzi started approaching these guys and letting them know that they still had time to save their lives and escape. At his look, they did not begin to doubt that it was far better to risk their reputations than their own lives, too. They made up a story that they had to rush to dinner and didn't have time for this fight. But from the outside, it's perfectly clear that it's not the dinner at all. It's that they can only attack the weak. Meanwhile, this boy, whose name is Qin Xiaoshan, he thanked his savior and said that if his help was ever needed, he would be happy to do so. To which Mike replied that he was also grateful, because the situation had given him inspiration to write another legend so that, in the long run, he can see the quantity of his life. He wrote a short story on the subject of insult and humiliation in school, which is tolerated by many people, and unfortunately they can do nothing about it. Then, he had a lot of thoughts that something really needed to be done about it. Those who are unable to respond to aggression and defend themselves should not be allowed to suffer because of someone else. Everyone knows that bullies most often hurt those who don't have the strength to respond, or those who don't have support. That way, if he can get guns to those who suffer from bullying, he can solve the problem. So to get on with it, he decided to write the same thing, but in his book, because that's the only way he's going to be able to fix this problem and make it go away. Every night, at midnight, on a site called Kingdom of the Dead, the names of people with evil, you can see a girl from that world. Her name is Mia. Some of them know her, but most of them have never heard of her. The thing is, she's a ghost, and only appears on special occasions when you need her help or need to punish someone. Meanwhile, late at night, there was some kind of conflict between female classmates at school, who asked some girl to stay away from this place and kept calling her names. Since this girl who has to tolerate this attitude can't influence this situation, she just tolerates it. And she's just waiting for the moment when she's finally off the hook. It's obvious that these girls who are bullying her are just trying to boost their self-esteem and credibility at her expense. But at the same time, if you look at each of them, no one is capable of something like that without their company and girlfriends like that, which makes it much easier and more fun to mock and make fun of someone. It turns out this girl had an object on her that she decided to use. With this item, you can summon a ghost and thus frighten your abusers. But when she warned her classmates that if they didn't stop insulting her, they'd regret it, no one believed her, and as it turns out, for nothing. After that, their self-confidence just evaporated. Everyone started running off somewhere and very loudly asking for help. But unlucky for some, Ghost Girl has successfully handled some of them, and made me realize that it's time to take responsibility for my actions. And it turns out everything that happened was filmed and recorded on some kind of camera. Sometime later, the victimized girl, who had endured the bullying of her classmates, was called to the office. Is the principal's office, high school, Jiang City to date? The number of abnormal deaths in the city has exceeded 200. The assistant principal reported that news reports indicate that no injuries were found on the victims' bodies. And for some reason, this girl, whose name is Aaliyah, is the only one suspected and apprehended by the special branch. It turns out, judging by the footage from the camera, that Aaliyah is the ghost. She turned into him the moment she picked up the red-colored object. But these people so far do not know about it. The girl came to the head of the special department, Qing Ji, and according to the assistant director, she is the only one who can help her. Aaliyah has been warned that they want to hear the truth from her and hope she won't hide things from them. A few days ago, a strange post appeared on the site that could not be edited or deleted. It contained information about an urban legend, a girl from the world of ghosts. Initially, everyone thought it was an announcement of some game because no one believed it could mean something else. Aaliyah said she waited until midnight and clicked on the link. Then, there was some sort of question on the screen asking what they could do to help her. And there was a box at the bottom where you could type in a request and submit it. For some reason, the girl didn't ignore the question and put some name in there. She knew she shouldn't have done it. She could have risked her life, but interest trumped fear, and as a result, she sent her reply after all. And of course, there was a good reason for it. Aaliyah wanted to end her suffering and thought of that it would be a great option to change your life for the better, becoming stronger, and perhaps gaining new abilities. Because that's the only way she thinks she can stop the abuse and get revenge on those who did it. Aaliyah had had enough, and was sure that if the girl from the ghost world really existed, it was impossible to miss such an opportunity, it was necessary to accept her help. She did it with full confidence, hoping it would make some kind of difference in her life. As a result, the message had already been sent, but what the name she wrote back meant was known only to her. 3 seconds after his response, nothing new happened. That was a cause for disappointment. When suddenly, the girl suddenly began to have a very bad headache and had a strange sensation that someone had appeared near her. And at someone, she hears a woman's voice asking if she was looking for her. And just seconds later, Aaliyah saw Mia, the girl from the ghost world, standing in front of her. They greeted each other, and surprisingly, in this girl's hands was the same red-colored object that looked very similar to the flower that Aaliyah was holding. Everything around was as if imbued with a special energy that was felt from the first seconds of appearing in this place. For starters, Mia warned that she was here to help. And despite the unexpectedness of it all, there's no need to be afraid of her. Then, she gave her this flower and warned her that once Aaliyah plucked the flower, they would make a contract. Aaliyah didn't doubt for a second that she could be trusted. Because according to Mia, after the contract is signed, the person the girl resents will be punished very badly and go to hell. But there was another very important point, and it turns out that sooner or later, Aaliyah's soul will end up there as well. Which, of course, stopped the girl and made her wonder if she was ready to make this deal. Mia explained that the curse of others is reflected in her karma, and her soul will no longer be able to go to heaven. It will be doomed to live in hell, just like the soul of the offender. Then, Mia gave some time to think about it for a while and said that either way, she exemplified whatever decision she made. Afterwards, the girl told the adults that when she came to her senses, she was already sitting in her room. At that moment, those people could hardly believe that such a thing was even possible and that anyone could agree to it. They began to inquire into all the details of the situation, but only one thing was clear. In case Aaliyah agreed to the proposal, she was doomed to damnation. After that, the woman asked her if the girl had been in contact with anyone in the last 2 days, and if anything unusual had happened. To which Aaliyah replied that she hadn't noticed anything like that. At one point, Ching-jer started using some ability that looked very impressive. Turns out she's using thief tactics. They say it's the hand that has the power to take whatever its owner wants. It is through this method that the woman hopes to be able to solve the problem and rid the girl of the curse. The price is that with this technique, one is left without a lot of things, and it's not clothes or other consumables, because the process looks so amazing that it seems the result can't disappoint. The point is that by using technology, one risks losing the most important thing, the happiness of oneself. So it would be very frustrating if this method had no effect. What kind of friend? Something very strange and unexpected starts happening to the girl. She completely stops controlling her body and starts screaming really hard like she's in incredible pain. Because of the overpowering sound wave, the nearby windows flew out and started cracking. Somehow, coincidentally, that sound was very well heard by Mike. It was immediately obvious to him that this sound was not due to strong winds, and it would not hurt to get to the bottom of it. He decided to listen to the sound better, so that he could at least get a rough idea of where it was coming from. Somehow he was able to analyze the immediate area and determine what had happened. He was able to see everything around him, and so all the walls of the buildings became transparent, which allowed him to see what was happening through the houses and the walls. But that's not the most amazing thing. He was able to hear the voices of people who were in the vicinity of that very school. According to their conversations, Mike at this point already knows that the window broke in the principal's office because of a girl being bullied by her classmates. He didn't expect it himself, and didn't think he had the ability to do it. It turns out the very name Aaliyah wrote on that site was the name of the classmate who bullied her. It turns out to prevent innocent people from being harmed, Mike has set up many psychological obstacles, and only by being desperate can people turn to Mia. And thus, in just a few days, over 100 students who have ever offended anyone in the city died. Doing a good deed gets the guy a few more points. But unfortunately, he didn't get too many points, because situations where someone offends someone give much less points than, for example, where there are some problems in the family. Anyway, Mike doesn't have to worry about longevity anyway, since he's already tripled the number of days since he only had 30. In addition to the indicators of the rest of life, he also needs to take care of the spiritual power, which, as yet, is absent. He realizes that if he doesn't think about it, it will also have unpleasant consequences. Just a few days later, he managed to collect 9 points of spiritual power, and for now, the guy can't think about it. It should last for a long time, and if it suddenly runs out, it's not too hard to recover it. But as time went on, Mike suddenly reached his limit and lost his temper. He started to make obvious changes that are hard to miss. When he wakes up today, he notices that his auditory and visual skills are much improved, and the same is true for his stamina. It's certainly very satisfying, but a lot of questions arise, such as what we can expect next and whether there is something more to strive for. He feels that if he continues to create stories, he will become really special. Meanwhile, the woman who was investigating that ghost situation concluded that the curse was strong, but luckily no one but Aaliyah was hurt. That's the end of her investigation, but Mike's case is just getting started. He decided to observe everything that was going on, because he needed to gather as much information as possible in order to draw a conclusion and see if his help was needed. As a result, the woman said that she would write in her report that Aaliyah had acted in self-defense, for which the girl thanked her very much and promised that this would not happen again. In the meantime, it's time for her to head back because she's done her job. But at some point, she felt something strange and inexplicable. By her senses, she felt the presence of someone who was watching everything that was going on and chose to remain unnoticed. She had an inkling that there was someone nearby who had amazing powers and could even influence the world. The woman began to scrutinize everyone around her, and at that moment, it was as if Mike could feel and read her thoughts. So in that second, he was able to stealthily hide and remain unnoticed. From that moment on, he knew that this woman also had some kind of ability to sense his presence. She's anxious to make sure that she's not wrong after all and that she's got it right. At the same time, Mike began to wonder if she was stronger and why she suddenly decided she needed to find him. After a few minutes, she managed to get close to the guy, just a few meters away from him. Mike realizes that she should never see the notebook, because if she gets her hands on it, she'll know what's going on right away, and maybe the guy could get in trouble. And how a woman is interested in finding out the truth and finding out everything they're trying to hide from her. She's not going to pass up this opportunity, and she's trying to do it any way she can. When all of a sudden, things start to change a lot. At which point, when she was too close, some guys came up to him, who wanted to invite him to the club. But is it really a true gift of fate that saved him from big trouble? At least things look really like that. Mike replied that he would agree to go with them after they let him go and stopped yelling so loudly. At that moment, that woman saw the situation and thought she was just imagining it. Then she called someone she knew and started talking on the phone. After that, he was disappointed in his abilities and thought that next time, he shouldn't be so confident. Meanwhile, the boys had already arrived at the Ghost Society's game room, and surprisingly, Mike's friends are still keeping him around so he doesn't run away like he usually does. And to somehow explain his behavior lately, the guy apologized and said he'd just been really busy. But for some reason, none of his friends believed those words and asked him not to cheat again. Surprisingly, this place looks quite different than one would imagine it to be, judging by the name, which has to do with ghosts. Surprisingly, this place is very popular. Usually a lot of people come here after school and relax until the evening. How all of a sudden, Mike casually mentioned that he was making up some stories, but those words didn't go unnoticed. His friends asked him to show them what it looked like, to which the guy replied that he had completely forgotten to bring that book with him, and unfortunately they would have to wait a bit longer. But in fact, he was seriously having thoughts that it might be a good idea to demonstrate it, if afterwards there would be no repercussions, after which they might die looking at the contents of this book. Then his friends started talking about the latest news. They're also aware of what's been going on with some people lately. They also told him that they'd recently stumbled across a website about a girl from the ghost world. It was very funny to him because Mike is the person who came up with it, so it wouldn't surprise him, because the guy knows more about it than anyone else. How suddenly, as soon as they tried to access this site, a warning popped up on the screen that there was some kind of error. It was a big surprise to them that right now they couldn't access the site for some unknown reason. After that, they were very curious if they could access the site with their phone, but it didn't work. It turns out that even Mike didn't expect this. but after a while he realized that surely someone must have blocked the site. At one point, the guy put that after that girl's story. Someone might have blocked the site so something like this wouldn't happen again. After that, he had to go somewhere. The guy apologized and said that next time he wouldn't go anywhere. It turns out Mike went to school specifically. Very interesting who he's trying to talk to and what he wants to say. But along the way, he runs into the guys who just recently ran away from him. Unfortunately, they're hurting someone again and they're not afraid to do it in the school hallway. Of course, they couldn't help but notice Mike this time. It's interesting to see how each of them reacts. The kid being bullied by his classmates asked for help, but surprisingly, Mike ignored him and explained that he didn't have time for this at all. The guy didn't expect him to do that because that time he acted differently. So the guys took advantage of the situation and went on with their business. Anyway, Mike is certainly not obliged to help anyone, but it's very frustrating that the guy has to put up with this attitude again. This time he really couldn't help anyone because he had a very important case that no one could help him with. So I had to ignore the situation because if nothing is done, a lot of problems can arise. In a hurry, Mike tries his best to get a glimpse of the people he's looking for, but so far, all to no avail. At that moment, he decided to use his ability to once again. That helps him see things that normal people can't see. It takes some effort, of course, but if it works out, the search can go a lot easier. Unfortunately, even with his ability, he still can't find these people, which is too bad, because they pose a serious threat to him. He urgently needs to find out their identities, because if he doesn't, sooner or later he will be caught, and then he will be unable to act, and will be in danger. Besides, it's time to remember that we need to increase life expectancy, so he has too many problems in a short period of time that need to be solved as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the Public Safety Office is busy blocking that very site, because thanks to that girl, they first found out about it and decided that they needed to make sure that no one else had a chance to get on it. It would help prevent future problems. In their opinion, to keep residents as safe as possible, they need to not only block access to the site, but also disable the ability to receive those very questions, which Aaliyah recently received because it was after that, in their opinion, the girl began to have problems, although in fact, if she had not been recognized as guilty, probably, she would not regret her decision. And nothing bad happened. And as for the downside, she agreed to it and knew what she was getting into. As a result, this woman made the decision that at midnight tonight, she would get rid of this site for good, and thus, do her job. But the thing is, she hasn't yet come up with a concrete plan on how to accomplish this, so she shouldn't be so confident in her abilities. Some people still wonder how she manages to set herself such impossible goals that a lot of people who have a lot of experience in this business have failed to deal with over time. In any case, she is not at all embarrassed by it. She is really very interested to know why such an easy thing as removing the site, in this situation, does not work out and seems something impossible. She thinks it will take at least a few days, because the site appears to be very well protected, making it difficult to take it down. After a while, it was midnight, and unsurprisingly, she failed to keep her promise, and once again, overestimated her capabilities. But so she wouldn't get too upset, she was supported by an assistant who kept suggesting options. At one point, an assistant asked if she was scared to be involved in a case involving ghosts, to which the woman replied that they posed no danger to her. Most likely, they once again devalue the seriousness of the situation and think they can handle any problem. The thing is, if they deal with the whole ghost having some kind of grudge or anger, it's going to be very bad. Because in this case, against him, these two girls are absolutely powerless. And what's amazing is that they know it very well. But for some reason, they continue to do it and risk their lives. It turns out that it's those signs that have some sort of offense that people most often notice, and those ghosts that just exist, no one ever notices them. After a while, the helper continued to motivate and says they can definitely handle the case. It's no wonder that the girl smiles just because she doesn't personally have to go with this case. Because in reality, things aren't as joyful and easy as she thinks they are. As it turns out, the defenses of this site are so strong that only the person who created it, or someone who has incredible power, can cope with it. And from the looks of it, this woman clearly doesn't have it. She still doesn't know a lot of things, although on the other hand, you can also understand her because she's just doing her job and trying to make it so that no one else gets hurt because of this site. It turns out that each of them, that is Mike and this girl, are doing their own thing, and each of them is right in their own way. We'll just have to see who wins this competition and who is smarter, more cunning, and faster. So far, only one of them has a plan, and that's Mike, of course. He knows exactly what he needs to do next. And also, keeping this site alive is much more important to him, because his life depends on it. As a friend, the woman decided to tell the truth to her assistant, and it turns out that assistants are assigned to those who are merely expendable. And what's more surprising is that whoever appointed her assistant knows that she's going to die. It happens to everyone who gets the job. Now it makes sense why she was appointed assistant even though she's only been here for a few days. In the meantime, the screen asked if they wanted to run the program. Apparently, it was the moment when this woman needed her assistant. It's for the assistant to risk her life, which is what her assignment is. As much as I hate to say it, but unfortunately that's the reality, but just to calm the girl down a little bit. The woman said that in the event of her death, the girl's family would receive money amounting to $5 million. As suddenly, the woman warned her that she had the option to refuse, leave the room, and leave the special unit. But surprisingly, despite all these warnings, the girl didn't refuse and decided to do her own thing. She confidently decides to press the very button that confirms her consent. They didn't know what was going to happen next, but at the same time, they were excited about something new. When suddenly, out of nowhere, some force appeared and started destroying everything around you. It means that the process has begun. They have no idea what's going to happen next. But one thing is certain, there's no turning back. They could barely make out what was on the screen, but for some reason, there was nothing there. Just a blank screen with no information or explanation of what had happened or what to do next. The girls made the decision that all they had to do was watch and hope that they would be all right. Although in fact, they know full well that nothing good will happen when dealing with this site. Looking at the red screen, and they noticed that something had appeared there. But even so, they still didn't understand what it meant. In fact, everything that started to appear on the screen is really hard for the average person to understand. When suddenly an image of some girl appeared on it. After that, they had a desire to turn back the clock and not make that mistake. They get the feeling that absolutely anything that might happen now could have a bad effect on their life, and at least their morale. The woman tries to pretend she's in control, but in reality, she has a complete misunderstanding of what's going on. She suggested that maybe it was some kind of warning. After some time, nothing new happens and they decided to go their separate ways. The woman praised the assistant and wished her success. Surprisingly, the assistant is unharmed, but perhaps the consequences will catch up with her a little later. It's possible that they don't know everything about what they're getting into. Meanwhile, some guy got a call from an unfamiliar number requesting that he help with a case about a girl from the ghost world, specifically that he look at a picture of an eye. But he knows full well that if he goes along with it and sees the picture, he'll be doomed to die. But despite the essence of this conversation, for some reason, he began to smile, because he did not understand why he was so openly told about it, and did not hide this information at all. They finally decided to settle, but with one very important condition. Making a deal, one of the agreements was to investigate together and not split up. Because it's a very dangerous business, each of them realizes that if anyone makes a mistake, they risk getting killed. But since the woman was near the Department of Public Safety, I decided not to risk talking about it in that place. 10 minutes before, Mike was trying to make sense of the situation and see if anyone was a threat to him. So far, all he knows is that that woman is trying to take down that website, where people can send some requests in return for a deal with the devil, because of which there are many complaints and deaths. When suddenly, at exactly midnight, Mike receives an unexpected message on his personal computer. It turns out this is what the infernal message looks like. It usually comes on at midnight sharp and pops up all over the screen. It came as a great surprise to him that no one had succeeded in blocking the site, despite many attempts to do so. Thus, he felt incredibly light and relieved, and most importantly, safe and happy. It becomes clear, since they failed to block the infernal message, It means that their abilities do not allow them to harm the girl from the ghost world, and him as well. But despite this good news, there's still one question as to how these two are connected to Special Victims Unit. Surprisingly, even on the internet there is no such information, and maybe this is done on purpose so that no one can find out anything about it. In any case, Mike realizes that it's clearly not to be taken lightly, and also, in order to preserve his life, he can't let someone destroy the one he created. So the guy decided that he could use some spiritual strength. Last time, he was able to reach the limits of his body's capacity. So there's no telling what will happen this time and whether there will be any changes. There is a possibility that after that, he may no longer be able to keep his strength under control, because strength is the only guarantee of survival. To take a risk, you have to think it through and make the right decision so you don't regret it later. As a result, he still couldn't overcome his curiosity and decided to check what would happen after increasing his spiritual power level. And strangely enough, he didn't have to wait long for the change. He felt something happening for a second too. As far as his body is concerned, it feels like it's starting to swell and it feels like the power is filling him up and there's more and more of it. After that, he was very curious if he had really succeeded in increasing his spiritual power. But he can only check it in the book, where it is written that the spiritual power has been added and is almost at its peak. The guy couldn't help but notice the change, because the sensations inside had changed so much that he began to feel completely different. Fortunately, after this experiment, there are no side effects, but on the contrary, the body became more relaxed and all the senses as if sharpened. It had been a long time since he'd felt something like this, and he hadn't even thought he was capable of such an enhancement to his own body. As suddenly, he had a strange feeling. Mike began to feel someone's presence and an unfamiliar energy. He began to stare at a single point and think that there was something obviously wrong here. At this moment, Mike realizes that someone is clearly looking at him, even though there's no one else around. Turns out this wasn't his first time. In fact, the guy had felt someone's gaze on him sometimes before. But now that his spiritual power has grown, he can easily feel clearly where that gaze and unknown energy is coming from. When suddenly, he opened some cabinet, where there was a strange box with fragile objects and a sign saying not to open it. He began to examine it closely and noticed something glowing with a red glow from it, which is creepy enough, even though it looks like a normal box. But it actually has this energy that's like a warning of danger and that you should stay away from it. At this point, he had a strong desire to know what was inside, but as Mike knows, curiosity usually has consequences. As soon as his hand starts to approach that box, it starts to shake very violently with fear, as if to warn him that he better not do that. And after a few minutes, he even began to ask himself why he was so nervous, as if something terrible could happen, and the contents of this box could hurt him. For starters, he decided to take it out of this cabinet and put it in a more convenient place where he could open it up. I guess past experience and the results of curiosity didn't teach him anything after all. Mike put that box on the floor and is finally ready to find out what might have gotten his attention. But surprisingly, this time, he's being quite careful and not in a hurry at all. As suddenly as he had touched a little to look and open the box a little bit, he felt at the same second that it would be a good idea to turn back the clock, so that by no means not to make that mistake and not to act so rashly, in fact, as usual. At some point, some unknown force struck him and pushed him away as if to push him away from himself. The guy obviously felt some kind of shock and noticed that the contents of this box were moving and gradually getting out. Apparently it's the same eye that he's had most recently, except there's nothing good about looking at him, much less touching him. Rather the opposite. It can only mean something related to death, and the guy knows it very well. But because of the surprise and lack of understanding of what was happening, he was unable to react in time and make sure he didn't look at him in any way. After some time, that eye stopped looking so terrifying and the whole situation turned into something normal and everyday, is in the same box, and no longer looks as intimidating as it originally did. It's very hard to understand what happened to them during that time. Is it really possible that, through some sort of ability, Mike disarmed the creature and turned it into his friend? Anyway, the fact that the guy wasn't hurt is pretty good and surprising at the same time. Mike turned on some cartoon for him and suggested dinner. The guy tries to woo it, but the creature hides from him for some reason, and is surprisingly afraid of something, as much as it sounds like they've switched places. In his opinion, the creature did not cease to look terrifying, but that did not change the fact that, in fact, it posed no danger at all, but it still had to be seen for sure. Since the creature refused dinner, Mike had dinner without him, when suddenly he got an unexpected phone call. And once he decided to answer the phone, he didn't expect to hear a voice that loud, asking him to read some important message. It turns out some anchor is reporting a death, and it has to do with, a girl from the ghost world. It turns out it's the homeowner who previously discovered this news on the site, and it turns out some person wants to meet this girl live on air. The owner of the house insisted very strongly that the lad should immediately go to this broadcast and see what was going on there. This man who started the broadcast began to warn his viewers that the real show was about to begin. He began to tell his viewers to make sure that after entering her name into the chat room of the infernal message, the girl from the ghost world never showed up. Thus, he asked viewers to write their opinion in the comments about whether it really exists. As a result, this broadcast has already gained a lot of viewers who were curious to see what would happen as a result of this experiment. It turns out, in order to keep everyone interested in watching this broadcast, this man started acting strange and telling some scary stories. Many people left comments and asked him to do it more often, so this person managed to become popular, and he did it in just a few minutes. Also, he had a slightly intimidating appearance and a terrifying stare. But in Mike's opinion, this man would be making a big mistake if he thought he had a complete understanding of how this system works. Meanwhile, late at night, the woman and the guy who had recently agreed to cooperate agreed to meet. They deliberately decided to go out at such a late hour so that no one would overhear the conversation, and it would remain a secret. It turns out they were also watching this broadcast, but they were doing it for a reason. They need to interrupt it and apprehend this man. In their opinion, this broadcast negatively affects viewers and makes them interested in the topic, causing time to many people. In fact, they have a really important mission because through their work, they can save hundreds of lives and do a good deed because it is very important. And such investigations really help to get rid of unwanted, unpleasant situations, which people begin to regret, having faced the consequences of their curiosity and visiting this site. In their opinion, the reason that nothing happens to this person who is broadcasting can be assumed to be because they have simply prepared and know what they are doing. It turns out they need to come up with a new plan so they can punish this person and let all these people know that by taking an interest in this topic, they could be risking their own lives. In this situation, it's really hard to decide which side should win, because someone is doing their job and trying to do a good job, and some are trying to survive and increase their life expectancy, and unfortunately, they can only do it that way. After a while, that man started to get down to business and decided to begin his experiment. He wanted to demonstrate how this site works and what it can do if you send that infernal message, when suddenly, he decided to press the very button to send his request, which means that this is how his broadcast became the most popular ever. But first, he needs to enter something name or think of something he is interested in. In the comments started writing ideas, and ask him to show the results of the experiment as soon as possible. The viewers are really very interested to see it. Then, he decided to set up the camera so that the audience could see his entire room. And so this man made it so that they could see absolutely everything that was going to happen in this room. And at this point, he started promising that just seconds later, they wouldn't regret coming to this broadcast. And they'll see that he was telling the truth, and the audience will see exactly what they've been waiting for. Meanwhile, he was getting really nervous, even though he'd been acting completely different from the way he'd originally acted. He had a feeling of fear and panic, which is not surprising because the anticipation of fear is the most terrible feeling, which is not at all comforting. When suddenly, the broadcast was suddenly interrupted. Viewers began to write their comments because they did not understand what was happening. As suddenly, Mike began to feel something strange again and sensed that something was happening in the room. At the moment, he didn't even turn around to look at what was happening, for he was sure he wouldn't see anything surprising. Then he got the idea that maybe his new creature was just playing around. But in fact, right behind him, something really scary is starting to happen. The guy doesn't even realize that right now, he could really use a backward glance. There was a girl behind him, but for some reason she came out of nowhere. At some point, Mike accidentally felt someone's presence at his back, and in the same second, saw a girl floating in the air in front of him, looking at him with red eyes. But from that look, it's hard to know what her intentions are or why she showed up in his room. Without saying a word, she began to approach him, which began to cause a feeling of alarm and apprehension. She doesn't say anything, but it makes it even more uncomfortable to be in her presence. And as soon as she got closer to him and he could see her face, he realized she was the girl from the ghost world. Meanwhile, the guy who usually gets beaten up by his classmates somehow ended up in the back room. He was deliberately locked in that room with no way to get out and call for help. When suddenly, for some unknown reason, he accidentally dropped his phone, apparently afraid of something and unable to control his reaction at that moment. It turns out that at that very moment, there was only 1 minute left until midnight, and if it wasn't just a coincidence, it might have something to do with what the boy was afraid of. As soon as his phone hit the floor, he got very upset and very angry with his classmates. Thus, he has become one of those who has a very strong grudge against someone and could be a potential willing recipient to go to a hellish website and leave his request to get revenge. That's what happened. He really had no choice but to turn to the ghost girl, when suddenly, someone stopped him from making that request because they came up to him at that exact moment. At that moment, the guy he had a grudge and hatred against saw his name on the guy's phone and immediately guessed what he wanted to do. For such a thing, he resolved to strike him again and warned him that if he dared to do so, he would regret it very much. The guy is enduring this cruel treatment and really wants to take revenge on everyone, whoever hurt him or did anything bad to him. To stop this bullying, the guy started explaining that his classmate was just imagining it, and he didn't type his name in. But of course the classmate didn't believe a word he said and didn't want to stop at all. After a while, when he was alone and able to pursue this case, he didn't want to wait and waste time. So he went to this site again and repeated his attempt to enter his request into the infernal chat room. Afterward, he was asked if he really hated the man he was going to take revenge on. And of course, his answer is all too obvious. For years now, he's dreamed of doing it, and as soon as the opportunity arose, he's not going to miss it. As a result, no matter how good a person he is, sooner or later, any person runs out of patience and wants to get justice. As the guy enters his classmate's name, meanwhile, Mike is not in the most pleasant situation either. This situation is so amazing that the guy has a question about whether the legend he created can destroy him, and that's what he's trying to figure out. Because everything that's going on right now looks suspiciously similar to something he personally came up with recently. And not to stall for time, Mike immediately asked her if she had really come here to take him with her to another world. But for some reason, the girl couldn't answer him that question. She stopped looking him in the eyes, but after a while, she told him something very interesting. It turns out that his name, for some reason, was in the infernal message. But despite that, she has no right to take him with her, because he is not an ordinary person and therefore is outside the rules. But did that boy put his name instead of the guy who is his classmate? In any case, the girl appeared in his room only to inform him that he could cancel the contract and send the man who had given his name to hell. Well, for starters, he wants to know the name of the person he hurt who wants revenge. Before he heard the answer, he began to think of names of people who might be offended by him, or those he had conflict with. But for some reason, he's never been able to figure out who this person might be. But just a few minutes later, he remembered some personalities who might hate him and would like to get rid of him. And as soon as he guessed that it might be the right woman, he asked the girl to take her with him. After all, he consented to it. Because if you don't, there could be a lot of trouble in the future because of her, and now that there's an opportunity to get rid of them. He wouldn't turn it down, but before he did, he asked to see her in person. But it turns out Mike got it a little wrong, and it was actually this guy who put his name in it. Just a short time later, the girl went to him to do the Lord's bidding, then really scared this guy. He didn't expect to be in this place instead of the person he wanted revenge on. It was immediately clear to him who stood before him and who this girl was. At this point, he started to ask why she had decided to take him and not Mike, as he had asked her to do. At that moment, some creature appeared between them, and it turned out to be Mike, but in such a way as to hide his face. Afterward, Mike asked him why the boy had put his name on it, and not the name of someone who had really constantly hurt and bullied him all those years ago. The boy's decision is a very strange one indeed, for he had a great opportunity to make sure that he never had to endure something like this again. But even without waiting for his answer, Mike took action, because, in his opinion, if this guy wanted the same thing for him, he deserved to be in that position himself. The guy started asking for help and apologizing for his action. He really didn't expect such consequences and wants to turn back the clock, so that he doesn't make a mistake that could risk his own life. But apparently it's too late. Mike has no patience for any kind of response or explanation. With each passing minute, the situation becomes more serious, for the boy's answer could actually determine his life. And literally at the last second, he asked to be heard to explain why he wanted revenge on Mike. It turns out he was very grateful for his first help, but since the second time, Mike walked by and didn't help. That's the reason he wanted to get back at him. It's really weird, because his classmates deserve to be punished more than Mike, because he's done a lot less wrong to him than those guys. As a result, Mike tells this guy that the girl from the ghost world was created by him personally, so Mike is not the one being punished. So Mike didn't think twice about what to do in this situation. He decided to send this guy to hell. And before that, said that if he had tried to punish someone who actually deserved it, things would have been very different. But since he made a very big mistake, he has to answer for his act and rash decision. Because you should have thought hard about who should really be in that seat in the first place. Anyway, you can't turn back time. Everyone made their choice and got what they deserved. When suddenly, by some miracle, he found himself in the office of that woman and her new assistant. In the meantime, the investigation into the very same broadcasting case continues. They've already managed to catch this guy, so there's an opportunity to find out what he knows about this site. For starters, they made sure he couldn't get away. Somehow they got that red flower, and with their powers, they decided to do something about it. As a result, that guy felt his hand stop really hot. It turns out that only the recipient can pluck the flower, so they have no choice but to make a new plan. After trying to figure it out, they're running out of options. Is shown. This woman is actually capable of breaking various curses and canceling the requests of people who have visited this site. But the thing is, if she keeps using her ability, she risks death. So she no longer has any desire to help anyone. So she needs to figure out some other way to help people without using her ability. So, she needs the help of this assistant. But before proceeding, she suggested that he think things over and back out before it's too late. For starters, all they've come up with so far is to send this guy to a special unit to be supervised. It turns out that after all this time, no one's been able to beat this system, which proves Mike's power. He had always wondered if anomalies existed in this world, and if they did, how much stronger they were, and if they could choose a specific target to destroy. Based on observation, it is obvious to him that there are people with abilities who have formed a so-called special department. They solve problems related to abnormalities. It's been clear for a while now that they've already tracked everything down. But fortunately, there's nothing they can do about it. The only thing left to do is keep watching them. Meanwhile, Mia informs her master that they have another task ahead of them, to which the boy replies that he already knows everything about it. Meanwhile, in the special interrogation room in the special unit, there is already a detainee in custody, who's trying to do whatever it takes to get out of this place. They're trying to get any information from him that relates to the situation. They're serious about having this conversation because at this point, they have no other way to find out, except that the topic of their why you're talking is different from the one about the website and live streaming. Maybe they're talking to someone else who might also be helpful in this investigation. This conversation is connected to some kind of anomaly, and this time, it's about someone's death. Some man, walking along the street, noticed that some force had taken over the body of a girl, and so, to avoid danger, he was forced to destroy her. It turns out that for a long time, they cannot deal with this situation and understand what was this terrible force, which began to appear in the body of some girl. Anyway, since this is a very interesting case and everyone wants to get to the bottom of it, it continues to be investigated and is not going to be ignored. It turns out this man who destroyed some girl is an associate of the woman he's partnered with, and this man who is in this office is her father and blames this guy for getting her killed because of this guy. He's sure that if she hadn't been there for him, she'd still be alive. But unfortunately, there's no going back. But that's not even the most interesting part. It turns out the aide came to this man to order him to start that infernal dialogue on that site. It turns out they only want this man for the sake of experimentation, because no one wants to risk their own life. But I don't understand why this man should obey them, since he has done nothing wrong and owes them nothing. Meanwhile, outside the door of this room stood the very woman who made sure that no one came in and heard what was being talked about. Some people actually asked what was going on there, and were told that no one had the right to take an interest in the case, because it's top secret, and not everyone has access to the conversation and this room. But that wasn't the only reason. It turns out that in this office is a file that, if opened, the person who did it could die just seconds later. This is one of the cases that is being investigated, and that no one has a right to inquire about or have access to, except those who are authorized to do so. But still, the woman told some information to her acquaintances, who were her former assistants. As suddenly, there remained a very loud sound, which greatly startled all present around the. No one could understand what was going on, and even less what to do in this situation. Only one thing was obvious: something dangerous had happened. The woman tried to understand what had happened, but for some reason she found it very difficult to do so. For some reason she began to see a picture of someone handing someone else that red flower. This whole situation takes place near a river, but unfortunately it's not clear what it all means. It turns out the girl this woman saw is the same girl from the ghost world. At some point, this girl looked at her with her gaze, and at that moment, the woman noticed that she was starting to feel very bad about herself. At that moment, she tried to understand what she should understand from what she saw, but unfortunately, all she realized was that she just needs to get in that room and check out what's going on in there. Most likely, it was definitely a sign of some kind, so the woman wasted no time and immediately knocked on the door. When people started asking her what was happening to her, she wouldn't explain anything to anyone because she didn't understand what it was. As suddenly, while conversing with her acquaintances, she begins to see a shadow of some kind, which seems to tell of that you can't ignore this situation, because it could definitely mean something. The woman knew immediately that it was definitely a sign of some sort, but what it meant was something that had yet to be sorted out. She'd certainly like to hope she's wrong, but either way, ignoring that vision isn't the best option. As soon as the woman entered this room, she saw something very unpleasant. She had an urge to get out, but if she did, it would be a very big mistake. Meanwhile, she turned her attention to her assistant who was lying on the floor. And right now, he's in the exact spot where Mike was talking to Mia the other day. At that moment, she looks him straight in the eye, and it's still very hard to understand what's going on. Maybe when the deputy asked that man to go to that site, he wrote that guy's name, and for that reason, since he had been punished, was compelled to go to this place and answer for all the wrong he had done towards that man's daughter. Apparently, he didn't expect such consequences, and by accident, forgot to check the name of the person that the girl's father was typing in. It's obvious to him that since he's already here, all he has to do is watch. Because here he can't do anything, run away or anything like that. He's trying his best to get away with it, but at the same time, he realizes there's no turning back. The guy's doomed to such a horrible death, but he has no idea what's next for him. Like all people who enter this place, he saw a large red eye in front of him. Surprisingly, despite the hopelessness of the situation, he keeps running somewhere, hoping there's a way out somewhere. But to make him stop being so confident, he's been locked in one position, unable to move. He starts to have thoughts that if he had the ability to turn back time, the guy would never take over someone's life. Because now he knows what happens when you become so careless about other people's lives. As a result, he has already realized that he has no choice but to watch and regret his actions. As suddenly, not far away, he noticed some creature and hoped it would not come any nearer than that. After that, the monster felt someone's gaze on him, turned around, and looked at the guy with a pissed-off look. Usually, the devil doesn't treat everyone in this place with kindness, but rather the opposite. Because it's obvious to him that if someone's in here, there's a reason for it, and that person deserves the worst of it. Of course, after such a look, you usually lose the will to live, because you don't want to experience everything that this devil can theoretically do, for all the bad things this guy's done in his life. And even worse, if the person who got here did something bad on purpose, their punishment will be even worse. After a while, the girl, Mia, took to the air and left this guy in the boat, right in front of the cliff. She just watched because she had no reason or orders to save anyone. Since this guy came here for this very purpose, she didn't interfere with the situation and just watched from afar as it was happening. She has no pity for the fellow, for she knows perfectly well what a terrible thing he has done in his world. So whatever's happening to him now, he fully deserves it and should take the punishment. But it turns out that somehow, amazingly, he was back in his own world. Perhaps everything that happened before was just a vision or a dream. The woman began to ask him all the details, because she needs to find out what exactly he saw in hell. It will help not only for the investigation, but is just interesting information for any person. The boy began to tell in detail all that he had felt and seen during that time, which caused a great deal of amazement. He's still incredibly scared, because the realization that if someone complains about him on that site, or he does some bad deed, it's going to get real. But that wasn't all. The guy went on to say some things, and it turns out the girl from the ghost world has consciousness, and was constantly warning him about something. It turns out she has a very pleasant voice, but what exactly she was saying was very frightening and disturbing. Thus, he's trying his best to do everything he can just to try to sincerely apologize for all the things they hate him for. But according to this woman, everything he just told them, it just can't be. It's very hard to believe, because no one's ever come back from hell and talked about what it's like there and how scary it is. They tried to calm him down, of course, but after all he'd been through lately, it was impossible to get back to normal quickly and forget these terrible feelings. As a result, they have decided that in the near future, they need to do everything they can to finally get rid of this site. Because it's not okay when someone can write someone else's name and that person has to go to hell. Meanwhile, Mike is talking to Mia, but for some reason she felt guilty in front of him, to which the guy replied that she had nothing to apologize for. It turns out when the guy was falling off the mountain, she saved him, and that's why he ended up in that office. That's the reason she's changing. But the thing is, in the guy's opinion, she did the right thing, because he knows people in the special victims unit, and if he died, it wouldn't be a good thing. Because if these people have a reason and proof that Mike had something to do with this, and is the creator of this site, he could be caught and arrested. So Mike realized that if he wanted to keep himself safe, he had to get stronger. When suddenly, the creature that lives in the guy's room climbs on top of the girl, and surprisingly, unlike its master, it's not afraid of the girl at all, and not even hiding from her in a box. Then, they began to think about something very seriously, for it was time to think about their future, or rather, about safety. Each of them started to suggest options, but for fear of making an irreparable mistake, these options do not seem suitable enough. In a given situation, with their capabilities and abilities, every mistake can be the last one. During all this time, they drew a little conclusion and realized that as long as a man's soul was in the ghost world, he was considered to be dead. So even if a person escapes from that world, it doesn't mean that world won't bring them back. At some point, they began to look more closely at different information to learn more about how the two worlds work together. Meanwhile, in a special department underground on the 3rd floor, there's a man walking around holding some papers with a picture of a girl with purple hair. He's trying not to make too much noise, and he's obviously here on some very important unclassified business. Now it makes sense why this department is underground and top secret, which can only be accessed by people who are authorized to do so by the rules. As soon as this man entered some room with only a single table and some unusual object with a red string on it, it turns out that with the help of this object, it is possible to learn some information. For this purpose, he put on this table those documents, thanks to which he will hear exactly the information that is related to the content of these documents. It turns out, since he planted the documents with the ghost girl's picture, so he got a chance to find out about her. Except we don't know why he needs that information yet. It's obvious that this is not the first time he's been in this room and knows how this item works. A few seconds later, he got some information about it. But for some reason, it wasn't enough. He needed to know more. Anyway, it's enough to draw some conclusions and have an idea of what he's interested in. All he knew up to this point was that this girl was very dangerous to ordinary people and would show up when someone was about to die. Meanwhile, the special division, which is on the 12th floor, has to vote on something. Among these people, there are those who don't agree to vote for something and don't think it's part of their job to do so. It turns out these people want to talk to the girl from the ghost world to make some kind of deal with her. As a result, some people think that it is very dangerous and makes no sense, and some people are just scared to do nothing because soon such an opportunity may not exist. They know a few rules. 1. She can only be contacted by people who have a strong grudge against someone. Secondly, it usually appears at certain times at night and cannot be seen during the day. Third rule, the contract will be concluded after the man picks the flower the girl gave him. And fourth, the area of her abilities is limited to this city. Sometime later, one of them alerted his co-workers that he planned to contact her, someone who supported the idea and didn't see anything wrong with it. Someone thought it could be very dangerous for each of them. Someone who is completely indifferent to the case and doesn't want to get involved. Some people wanted to do the same thing, but since there was one candidate, they trusted him with the job and were happy because they wouldn't have to risk their own lives. And of course, there were those who wanted to ignore the problems that have something to do with this situation because they are sure that this is some kind of fiction and it doesn't happen in the real world. For a moment, the man thought again about his words and whether he was going to take them back. He was incredibly angry about the situation because knowing that it was inevitable made his mood very bad. And there's a sense of uncertainty and fear, and not knowing how to deal with it all. Sometime later, after silence, some man praised him, but asked that he not act too rashly and not forget the safety of those around him. Right now, the most intense conversation in recent memory is taking place about how to solve a problem that no one has ever faced before, and no one has any idea what it is or who is behind it. The only quick solution to this problem is to find out the creator of this site. But just to prevent that from happening, the guy tries everything he can to get ahead of them and secure his life, which, at this point, depends on declassifying his identity and how quickly they can find him. The thing is, it's not as easy as it looks, because if Mike is relatively easy to find, the girl from the ghost world is impossible, especially if she already knows that these people are looking for her. So it turns out that someone is trying to escape and save their life, and someone else is trying to do their job and find these people. But the thing is, they're each right in their own way. It's not Mike and Mia's fault that their lives depend on how many people go to their site. And also, the people in the special unit are not to blame for the fact that they got such an assignment, and are obliged to safeguard the lives of other people. Meanwhile, high school was also not without its oddities. 3 guys look at their classmates and don't realize what's going on around them, because everyone's too active and talking about the same things. But it turns out as soon as they're classmates, they immediately decided to approach them, since everyone already knows that these 3 know Mia. But since the guys didn't feel much like telling them anything, they immediately made the decision to run away so they wouldn't say anything unnecessary. Mike would absolutely hate for anyone to find out unnecessary information about him, especially that could badly affect his life. After a few minutes, they managed to run away and remain unnoticed. Mike's friends didn't expect that after such physical exertion, you couldn't tell he had run the same distance as his friends, who are very tired and it is problematic for them to even talk, stand on their feet, or anything like that. When suddenly, as they were talking about their business, some girl came up to them and said hello to each of them. Her name is Sia. The first thing she asked was if she could join them as she was interested in the topic of ghosts. And of course they were surprised to be approached by such a beautiful girl who wants to join their team. No wonder they didn't even bother to consider whether they wanted to communicate with her about it. Their answer was too obvious. It turns out she's been interested in urban legends for a long time and has filled out the registration form more than once. From the outside, it's pretty obvious why they agreed to have her on their team. When suddenly, all at once, everyone got some message, which caused a lot of surprise because it had never happened before. Everyone pulled out their phones at the same time and started checking to see what the message had gotten them. After that, Mike asked this girl if she had many friends because obviously she must have quite a few, to which the girl replied that there weren't that many, and then she decided to tell everyone that there was a new game that had recently come out. It turns out, she says, that already many people play this game. It can relieve tension, cheer up well, and even calm down if necessary. And the name of the game is Your Turn, which sounds weird enough for a game that can cheer you up or calm you down. The guys had an inkling that she had deliberately decided to befriend them in order to get them into the game and make some kind of profit. Meanwhile, Mike had already arrived at his home and began to ponder that his current abilities belonged to the second level of spiritual power. Therefore, he could sense the supernatural. The thing is, when he was chatting with Sia, he sensed that she had something unusual on her phone that she was trying to hide and not tell anyone about. At this point, he decided to look in his book, where usually there are clues, and this time, the book advised him to stay away from this girl if he felt anything suspicious. Mike didn't quite realize how serious this warning was, as suddenly, another message came through on his phone. It turns out, in the chat room of his classmates, a girl invites to play this game, and it seems that many do not even think of refusing. Apparently, he won't be able to ignore this situation because it's really very strange. At that moment, a little monster wanted to play with him, but the guy asked him to wait a little while because he had some other things to do. But the monster ignored these words, for he was tired of waiting for his master all day long. He pounced on him with all his might and began to hug him, though from the outside, it looked a little intimidating, for one does not know what to expect from this creature. When suddenly, this monster literally split in two, one part trying to close its master's eyes, and the other part of the... She went to the table where there was a phone with some messages on it. At this point, Mike doesn't even realize he's living with a creature who's figured out how to trick him. And that's very bad, because if it happened this time, it's possible that the next time, the situation could be much more dangerous. It's very interesting to find out what this little monster is up to and why it took him to close his master's eyes to do it. Was it really something he should never have to see? As suddenly, it asked its master to open his eyes already and look at the little surprise. At this point, Mike didn't know how to react because from the outside, it all seemed pretty intimidating. It turns out that the monster has demonstrated that he was able to change in appearance, which means that he may have developed some abilities. But whether they are good or bad remains to be seen. Either way, Mike doesn't even consider that there might be a problem with it. He took the creature in his arms and began to genuinely enjoy this incredible surprise. The two of them began to rejoice at this event, and surprisingly, the guy completely forgot and stopped noticing that he was getting some messages. It turns out that the chat room is still discussing this game and wondering how it works, to which the girl replies that as soon as they get to school, she'll be sure to tell and show them everything. Meanwhile, the next day came, but surprisingly this time the boys went somewhere else instead of school. Is an abandoned building outside of town that they've been going to since morning. Turns out they only came here to finally find out what the game is. The thing is, this is the place they were asked to come by their classmate, Sia, who promised to tell them all about it. And as soon as the guys started talking about her being late and being some kind of weirdo, the girl immediately showed up and apologized for being late. From the outside, it might seem like she's trying to manipulate them with her looks and get them into some trouble. But whether or not that's the case, we'll see after a while. And just as the guys were trying to give her a bouquet gift, they noticed that the girl didn't come alone, and there was some guy standing next to her. They immediately had so many questions, and of course, the smile and the mood disappeared. They asked who the guy was to her, to which the girl replied that they were just good friends. But from the outside, you can clearly see that before answering this question, they started to get embarrassed and didn't know what to answer. After a while, Mike got tired of watching this conversation, so he decided to get down to business. In his opinion, the game called Your Turn was supposed to be online, and so he's very surprised that it's not. To which the girl replied that, in her opinion, to get rid of bad emotions, much more effective in real life. In addition, according to her, there has not yet been a single person who complained about this game. After that, it was time to learn about the rules that the girl, for some reason, had been hiding until now. At this point, Mike decided to warn his friends to keep a close eye on what was happening and not to fall for the manipulation, because it's unknown what these two are up to and what their intentions are, given the fact that they are still hiding the rules and asked to come to this very place. After that, everyone's off somewhere. Every second things get weirder and more suspicious. Turns out Mike only agreed to go with his friends because he doesn't trust this stranger if he needs to. He can help his friends. because judging by the title, they're gonna need help. And luckily their friend realizes that. So they're incredibly lucky to have someone with them who can see something suspicious in this situation. Meanwhile, as soon as they started to enter this building, Mike, once again, asked her to familiarize them with the rules. But surprisingly, he didn't get an answer right away. And in that second, he wondered if he wouldn't, or if it would be better to just change his mind and go home. Because with every step, he has the feeling that if they don't leave now, it'll be the biggest mistake of all. They had a lot of questions that no one was even in a hurry to answer. It turns out that at the lowest level, you just have to tell some stories. After that, say the name of some person who will be next. As for the highest level, at least 4 people participate, and the game is played in real life. 4 people must stand face to face in a cramped room. The person on the first floor starts moving toward his neighbor. Then he must pat him on the shoulder, tell a story, and move on to the next player. And it's very dark and you can't really see anything around you. If there are more than 4 people, one of the players takes a free floor, the game starts from the first floor, and so goes to the last, 4th floor. They have already started playing this game, and apparently they have already regretted it very much, because everything looks so scary that you want to go home and never come back here again. Because of the total darkness, they began to get scared of each other and feel in danger, each having the feeling that someone was trying to hurt them, and that the point of this game is for something bad to happen to one of the contestants. Meanwhile, the game began. The first player began to tell the story that his brothers had once died one by one, and then he asked if the other player knew what the reason for this coincidence was, to which the player replied that he didn't even have any guesses, to which the first player said that once upon a time he had insomnia, and in order to continue sleeping peacefully, he decided to destroy his brothers. And as a result, he received no punishment for it, to which another player who was listening to the story replied that it was just awful. Then, according to the rules of the game, the first player told his story and then touched the shoulder of the player to whom he had just told the story, and thus passed on the opportunity to be next. After that, the second player should go to the floor above and tell his story to the third player. Meanwhile, the next player is already waiting and doesn't understand why he has to be in this darkness for so long. He began to get very nervous, for in the utter darkness playing a strange game, it was no wonder, when suddenly he heard someone's footsteps, and at that moment he happened to see that his phone was running out of power. Mike decided to ask the girl for help, and asked if she had any kind of charger with her, because that way he wouldn't be able to play the game if his phone was low on battery. But for some reason, the girl ignored his request, and started telling her story, but at this point, she really started acting really weird, like she was hiding something. Mike was well aware that at any second, something unexpected could happen, so was very focused on everything that was going on around him. The girl started telling me that one night, 4 guys were out with a girl. It was just an ordinary day, and no one had any idea what was in store for them. It was raining heavily. The guys quickened their steps, but the girl was in no hurry. Then the guys reached their destination, and the girl was not wet from the rain at all. Sia asked if the 5th player knew what the reason was. Mike thought for a long time about what the reason might be, but tried to speculate nonetheless, that maybe that girl died and the others were carrying her at that moment. To which the girl replied that he was very guessing, and surprisingly answered correctly. It was very surprising to her that he was able to solve this terrible riddle and gave the right answer. Then, she reminded him that he needed to pick a story and go back to the first floor to tell it to the first player. He was already waiting for him. Surprisingly, at the moment, there's nothing suspicious going on, and by the looks of it, there's still more to come. After a few minutes, Mike started to pick out a suitable story, but he still didn't realize what was in store for them all next. He has a lot of thoughts on the matter, but anyway, all he has to do at this point is just pick the right story to tell. How suddenly, when he had already made his choice, the guy asked if she wanted to go there together, to which the girl replied that she couldn't break the rules. After that, the lad went to the lower floor, and never for a moment stopped thinking that there must be some trick here. When suddenly, on the way, Mike heard some suspicious sound that startled him very much. Then he saw his friends outside that building and he calmed down. But surprisingly, Next to them, there was a girl who just refused to go with him and said she didn't want to break the rules. From that moment on, he really thought about it seriously, because after this, it was impossible to ignore her strange behavior. He looked at her and asked why she says one thing and then does something completely different, to which the girl replied that she was just too scared. And after one of the players came down from the third floor, they came to him. But for some reason, they never heard his voice. They felt it was better to stick together and not go against the rules. Then someone suggested we just go outside and wait for everyone else. But all those words, for some reason, surprised him very much. Because the thing is that Mike did not go up to the fifth floor. He personally confirmed this and said that they were apparently not alone in that building. But after a while, he just laughed and said it was just a joke, and asked if he had succeeded in scaring them. But even after that joke, everyone got the feeling that something strange was going on. So, it was difficult for them to contain their emotions, and for this reason, they got angry with their friend and asked him not to do it again. But just a few minutes later, Mike started saying some weird words and looked at the girl with a peculiar look, as if he already knew something. He approached her slowly, to her surprise and a sense of dread. As a result, he's doing very well, but so far it's hard to understand why he started acting so cryptic and what his words mean. It turns out he just wanted to tell them something very important. By his reasoning, there's a chance of that society of ghosts. They can overcome altogether, and in general, in all legends, strange things start happening to people after they have separated and acted separately from each other. So he just decided to remind them to keep that in mind and draw some conclusions. As suddenly, at some point, the girl started feeling unwell and suggested that this game be postponed to the next day, and then asked her friend to walk her home. For coming back at night, she would be very frightened and unsafe. After that, they said goodbye at once and decided to go home, for there was no point in going out late at night anymore. But it turns out it was so late that just a few minutes later, it was morning. One of them started asking Mike if he planned to come back to this place and play this game again. But at this moment, the guy was focused only on his thoughts, because what happened a few minutes ago is really astonishing. According to the girl, she didn't talk to him during the game, but in that case, it raises a very interesting question. Who told him a story about a girl who was out with her friends in the rain? The guy kept it out of the conversation so as not to freak anyone out or seem strange. I can see why he just turned his words into a joke, because there was a chance he might not have been believed. He suddenly told his friends that he wanted to go back and see what it was and who he was talking to. For, in his opinion, it could not have seemed to him that he was talking to any man. Without explaining anything to his friends, he began to return to that knowledge, and of course his friends would not leave him alone in this situation, and ran with him. But the amazing thing is, despite wanting to figure it all out, he doesn't want to go back to that place as much as possible. And finding out that there was an outsider in the building who wasn't one of the players. Despite the very serious danger and the unknown, Mike didn't think for a second about just ignoring the situation and going home. Meanwhile, the Special Victims Unit continues to deal with the ghost girl. During all this time, they found a man who spread a legend called "Look Through the Gap," and also they got a picture that was also taken by this man. Surprisingly, they actually did manage to get some useful information. So they have to wait for a response from the think tank, which should provide some information soon. To date, the woman is very pleased with the result of her work, because finally, she is beginning to recognize something, helps her to investigate the case much faster. Plus, having some information that is useful is much more interesting to work with, because there is something to work with, unlike just a few days ago. But in any case, at this point, they're still a long way from finalizing the investigation of this case. They understand it perfectly well, but they can't do anything about it. It's their job and their assignment, which no one has the right to ignore. But despite the complexity of the situation, the woman has a little relief, because everyone knows that it is impossible to investigate this case in a few days. So, no one put restrictions on her. It turns out she was asked to do the job and told no one would rush her into it. Meanwhile, her assistant is trying to scrutinize this photo, pretending it's helping him understand something. A few days later, they went out of town to socialize with some man. In their opinion, he was the one who could have taken those red-eye photos, meaning he could tell them some useful information for the investigation. And of course they did to him in their own style. These two made it so the man couldn't move and had to talk to them. It turns out this man didn't even try to pretend he didn't know what they were talking about or what they were trying to find out. The man admitted that he was the person who took the photos, and also asked to take into account that he only took 2 of the photos, and the rest were not his work. But even though the man answered completely honestly, the woman's assistant would not believe him. He approached him and ordered the man to tell them absolutely everything he knew and everything he had ever seen. It turns out some of these photos were taken from his girlfriend's house. They saw her occasionally and were very good friends, even too much so. At some point, he wanted to go about his business for a while, but at some point, he noticed that the walls in the room were starting to move. The man was very frightened at that moment and decided to check what it could be because it had never happened before. When suddenly, he sees some strange creature in the closet that looks very intimidating. It was very unpleasant to look at. And of course, he had no idea where it could have come from or what it was in the first place. 2 hours earlier, Mike is already inside a building where something inexplicable is happening. He decided to use all his powers to get to the bottom of this situation and realize he wasn't imagining things. Mike started saying some words that were supposed to help him in this endeavor. He began to call out to the girl he was talking to, for she was exactly the same appearance as his classmate. But for some reason, at some point, he felt something suspicious again. But even more surprisingly, Mike didn't even think about the fact that in a place like this, it might be a good idea to turn around and look around once in a while. Behind him, something strange was really going on. He could feel it, but for some reason, for a long time, never thought to turn around and see what was going on. As suddenly, with each passing second, he began to feel more and more strongly that there was definitely someone nearby. But for some reason, he didn't want to show his face. And at that moment, he finally decided to turn around and see if anyone was standing nearby. But unfortunately, Mike couldn't see anything in the darkness, because it's impossible to see anything even a few meters away. And that's too bad, because in a situation like this, it's very difficult to react at the exact moment when someone is approaching him, because it's possible that there's someone around who might have bad intentions. When all of a sudden, the guy suddenly heard someone's voice telling him that he really wanted to die. Mike was very much startled, for he had not expected to hear someone's voice. Also, that voice is so unpleasant that the guy started grabbing his head, covering his ears so he wouldn't hear it again. At that moment, he experienced such a terrible sensation that he even stopped noticing everything around him and couldn't imagine what could be worse. It's very strange, because it's just some voice that made him have a terrible sensation and a bad headache. The guy was starting to really regret deciding to come back here without anyone's support. It was as if he'd forgotten everything that had happened up to that point and started asking himself how he'd gotten here. It wasn't just them. His friends who had stayed outside waiting for him also started asking each other what this place was like, as if they were seeing it for the first time. It's very strange because it's like the 3 of them have lost their memories and completely forgotten that they were in the same place a few minutes ago. Meanwhile, the investigation continues. The woman and her assistant went to another neighborhood to talk to some girl. They think she's involved and want to know something, so they knock on the door, hoping someone will open it. The door was opened by some girl. She looked very much like the one the man they had been talking to before had told them about. You could tell by her reaction that she wasn't exactly happy to have guests in the middle of the night. It turns out they didn't come alone. They had the same man with them who had told them about the strange situation. The girl began to scrutinize their appearance, and at some point noticed something surprising that she certainly didn't expect. She saw that the woman had a badge on her jacket, which indicated that she was from a special department and had the right to ask her something, even in the middle of the night. It turns out that as soon as she allowed them into her house, the woman started asking where the girl's son was at the moment, to which the girl laughed and asked where he could have come from, to which the woman showed her 2 photos, and asked if she'd ever seen the creature in the photos. And as soon as she started looking at this image, she was very much surprised that this was what they had come for. And then she told me that he'd been dead for a long time, and at that moment, she had a very surprised look on her face. Afterward, the girl said it happened 2.5 months ago, to which the woman asked how it happened. It turns out that a few months ago, when the girl came home, she found that her baby had died, and it was probably because of the guests who had scared him very badly. After this story, the woman immediately decided to ask where this child was and how they could find him, to which the girl replied that he was outside the city, far away in the woods. After that, they went to that forest, and with the help of a girl, they found the child. Then she was taken away by the police because she is still a suspect. When they saw how bad it was very hard for them to look at it, because there was so much damage. Meanwhile, the woman's assistant asked her opinion whether the woman regretted what she had done to her child, to which the woman replied that she did not think so. After that, they started to look into the situation even more closely, but so far, they're not doing a very good job of it. As soon as that girl was taken away by the police, they knew it was going to be hard for her. The girl looked at them through the window and asked that they listen to her and not jump to premature conclusions. So suddenly, she decided to confess very loudly that it wasn't really a baby, but some creature that was always watching her. After that, the woman asked the police at that very second that they should not believe a word she said, for such a thing could not happen. So they really did draw the wrong conclusions, and from the looks of it, the girl really wasn't fooling them. Meanwhile, Mike is still on that abandoned building, and for some reason he's completely out of control. It's like he's being controlled by some unknown force. The guy doesn't look like himself at all, and starts walking the floors without realizing it. At this point, he's talking about how he's had enough of everything, when suddenly his talisman starts falling from his hand, and at that moment, Mike has no control at all. It's very scary to watch his actions, and the fact that it's like he's become a different person controlled by an unknown force. On top of that, he even had a change in his look and gait. It became like something very intimidating and not like him at all. Suddenly, he distinctly began to notice that something was happening to his body. It was experiencing some incomprehensible sensations that restrained his movements. At that moment, he would regain consciousness for a second and feel something happening to him. Mike made the decision that this couldn't go on and needed to get out of this place as soon as possible. On the topic, with the help of his talisman, he tried to contact the creature that is in his home, and the girl, Mia. He wants to find out how he got here. At that moment, some kind of message came on his phone, but surprisingly, he couldn't even reach for his phone. At the same second, he literally froze in one place and couldn't move. It's very strange because every minute something more and more inexplicable happens. He really felt as if something was holding him back and preventing him from taking even one step. As suddenly as he managed to get down one floor, which was very difficult. At that moment, he was followed by some creature that left behind it red marks on the floor. Mike, only after a while, started to feel something present, but for some reason, he found it very hard to turn around and see what was going on behind him. If he'd only known how scary it looked from the outside and that someone was really after him, he never would have come back to this place. As suddenly, he heard someone call his phone again, but surprisingly, he didn't even have to take the call as he heard someone's voice asking where he was going. Mike immediately began to realize that this was the very creature he was looking for. But listening to his voice was so unbearable that the guy wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. At this point, the creature told him that it was actually him talking to him when the guy was playing this game with his classmates. At this point, the guy started to feel something very scary and realized that he had to run away, as if he suddenly saw his classmate, but at the same time, he knows it's probably some kind of visual trickery. Every second, it's getting harder and harder for him to be in this place talking to some strange creature. In the same second, he somehow found himself in a different place and saw something very strange in front of him. A great many wooden objects appeared around him, with some people in them, and as it turned out, his friends were there too, which is a very creepy sight. But anyway, he decided to come back here and see for himself. Of course, seeing his friends like this, and especially in this place, is not very pleasant. Plus, it's very hard to know if it's real and when he'll be able to go back home. As suddenly, his friends began to rise, but for some reason, it was as if they were completely oblivious to their friend, and each of their movements was exactly the same, as if they were being controlled by someone else. Mike has noticed that they have become somehow different, which is starting to get very alarming. He began trying his best to do everything he could to get them to come to their senses and start controlling their minds. After a while, he noticed that no matter what he said to them now, they wouldn't hear him. At this point, he has absolutely no idea what's going on or who can control what's going on. He even got the impression that everything that was happening now was some other reality, and that everything that was happening was just some terrible dream that would end soon. Each of his actions feels like it takes a very long time and does not produce any result, because it is obvious that he is only partially in control of his consciousness and is not even able to get out of this place on his own. He even had some very strange thoughts that started to freak him out, and surprisingly, he couldn't stop it. After a while, these guys started coming up to him and talking to him, but their voices were just as awful as the time he heard someone on the 4th floor. Everything that began to happen next looked even more frightening and incomprehensible. Apparently, from this point on, if he could get home, the guy would never agree to return to this place again. When he suddenly heard someone's voice saying that it was his turn. It sounded even more intimidating and incomprehensible because that was the very name of the game. After that, he started losing consciousness the second he did, and he was out of control, and it looked really scary. And if that's what their classmate was trying so hard to keep from them. And surprisingly, the guy didn't even fight back and replied that he agreed to be next. That is, immerse himself in the very object in which he had found his friends. But what would happen to him next? Would that be the end of the... It's hard to believe a guy with such amazing powers wouldn't even try to be the first to get out of this place. A few seconds later, he was completely locked in, unable to get out. Meanwhile, some girl is standing outside this abandoned building writing something in her notebook. She wondered why no one had come out of there yet, but she wouldn't just stand around waiting for something to happen. She's thought of something, because she's determined to make a difference. At which point, she pulled out an object that looked very similar in size and appearance to an ordinary coin. She tossed it in the air, and literally in that second, that coin began to glow a golden color. There are some drawings on it, and they must have some very important meaning. And it was at that moment that Mike suddenly came to his senses, finally began to fully control himself, and realized what had just happened. Surprisingly, after that, he was immediately in his room. He still had a sense of dread afterward. So the first thing Mike did was go to the bathroom to get himself back to normal and start analyzing everything that had happened to him that day. From that moment on, he no longer felt safe even at home, for after such a thing, there was probably no place where he could feel at peace. At this point, he has a feeling of lack of air. It's very hard for him to breathe, and it's not surprising because up to this point, he's been in a closed space. The first thought he had was that he wanted an answer to the question of whether he was really dead, or whether it was still some kind of vision or dream. He clearly remembers a situation where he had no control over his actions and died in some unknown place. After some time, Mike remembered that he himself had wanted to return to the abandoned building. And also, he had a feeling that his memories were missing some very important details. I guess from now on, he'll want to figure it out, unless he thinks it's better not to make the same mistake that almost got him killed. After that, he decided to look at his notes in his notebook, for surely there might be some useful information there. But surprisingly, the notebook didn't have that information. But the guy noticed something even more interesting. At the moment, his life expectancy was supposed to be 96 days, but for some reason, it said 1 day less than it should be. The next day, Mike couldn't stop thinking about what might have affected the number of days he had left to live. He was even starting to think it had something to do with the abandoned building, except that he has yet to find out exactly how that might be connected, if it is. In any case, before you start thinking about it, you need to understand where all his classmates have gone. Because usually, there are a lot of them here, and this place is never in such a condition. As suddenly, he heard a familiar, suspicious sound coming from the closet in this room, at which point, the guy didn't even have time to turn around before some girl started coming out. At this point, he has a lot of questions, because how could it be in the closet in this room, and how she would know his name? The girl is really suspicious. Well, really, this is the girl who helped him survive. As suddenly, she told him the same thing their other classmate said. She's interested in ghosts and wants to join the team. To which the guy replied that he was the only member of the club at the moment, and as it was about to close, there was no point in her joining. And then he asked her how she had gotten here. It turns out that all this time, the girl had been following him, and found out that it was after the guy had returned to the abandoned building that, according to her observations, it was after that everyone had disappeared somewhere else. In fact, Mike had also noticed the coincidence, but until that moment, he hadn't even realized that it had happened after he'd returned from the abandoned building. So he became even more interested in the situation, because it seemed to him that there must be a reason for all this. He started to have different thoughts about it, but unfortunately, without some useful information, he has a hard time realizing how it's all connected. And at some point, he starts remembering certain events and the words of his classmates. He was beginning to miss them very much and wanted to see them soon, because it was probably because of him that they were missing, and so he wanted to fix it. After a while, he started to speculate that maybe his friends were missing because of that classmate and her friend. After that, the guy decided to take this girl's notebook and look something in it, because there might be something very interesting in it. But for some reason, she asked him not to, and suddenly took her notebook from him. Apparently, she really had something to hide from him. According to the girl, he really shouldn't read what it said. And then, she explained that she really didn't have any evil intentions. After that, Mike didn't know if he could trust this girl, and at this point, decided to take some kind of profile. It turns out he did let her join the club, but on one condition, that she bring some more of her friends. To which the girl replied that she was very grateful for his trust, and promised that she would invite her acquaintances to this club in the near future. Then, she said goodbye to him, and told him she was going to go look for someone. It was very obvious from her reaction that she was genuinely happy with the outcome of this conversation. She even started smiling and acting differently, as if the guy had fulfilled her dream. At that moment, unlike her, Mike was experiencing a completely different emotion. He was very curious as to what her goal was and what she actually wanted, because she's obviously hiding something, and she doesn't want him to know what's in her diary. After a while, the guy tried not to think about it because he had a matter that was much more important than that. Namely, it concerned that very game. And also, we'll have to find out where his friends have disappeared. Because recently, except for this girl, he has not seen a single person. Turns out the girl has information from somewhere that this club is the safest place in town. And it turns out the most important person in the club is Mike, which is why she asked his permission to join. But that's not all. The thing is, she's long been aware that it's not just the city, it's the whole world. The thing is, she wants to be his girlfriend, and she needs it to make herself even safer. So she decides to keep a close eye on him and stay close to him at all times. Meanwhile, Mike has no idea that some girl is planning to be his wife in the future. But at this moment, he's interested in something else entirely, which is to get to the bottom of why the number of days of his life isn't increasing. Thus, he again made the decision that he needed to get even stronger, because it was the only option he could think of in this situation. It turns out that all other characteristics he is completely satisfied. They do not need to be increased, as opposed to a characterization that says the number of days of his life, which is the most important thing. Thanks to his amazing powers, he was able to increase his strength very easily, which should affect the number of days. He even learned to fly in the air, as well as there are some new abilities, which cannot but please, because after all that happened, they will not be superfluous, and sooner or later will definitely come in handy. It turns out that one of the abilities he gained from the power boost is attracting objects, which works within a 10-meter radius. As soon as he found out about it, Mike couldn't help himself and decided to test his mettle. The first item he wanted to tug towards him was a packet of potato chips, and surprisingly, once he wanted to airlift it, it wasn't difficult at all. But somehow he's not surprised at all, because after that abandonment, he can hardly be surprised at anything. At the moment, he has the third level of spiritual power, which feels and works very well. Now he has many more advantages and amazing possibilities, when suddenly, he decided to come up with some legend that could bring dead people back to life. But unfortunately, it will only be possible to do this after some time, and for that, you need to earn some more points. Afterward, he wondered if anyone had played this game, but through a phone rather than in real life. And also, he still doesn't understand how the destruction of players happens and who invented this game. It can be assumed that if the girl decided to join the club for the sake of getting them into this game, most likely she may be the creator and originally planned to destroy each of them. In any case, it remains to be seen whether the numbers and players affect the sequence in which each of them will die. It sounds very daunting, but unfortunately, if this situation is not dealt with, a lot of people could get hurt in the future. Mike suggested that this game is being played in an abandoned building for a reason, and perhaps there is something in the building that affects the well-being of the players, and most likely there's some kind of energy in it that's bad for everyone. But there is another, no less interesting and surprising option. Perhaps his classmate just has to invite his acquaintances there for some reason. In the meantime, the boy had already returned to his home, for it was evening and time to rest. His little monster ran up to him at once, who was already waiting for his master and was very glad to see him. After that, Mike, let's assume for sure that chat room where players can communicate doesn't exist anymore. At this point, he made a very strange decision to continue the investigation. Mike decided to re-engage. Well, this time, he has an opportunity that no matter what happens, nothing can destroy him. So he can see what they're trying to hide from the participants in this game. Anyway, apparently he's really not going to give up, and he's not at all embarrassed by the fact that last time he almost died because of his own curiosity. This guy is really brave and apparently has no sense of fear. It's very interesting to see the result of this experiment, because at this point, he already knows a lot, and he's also gained new abilities. Meanwhile, some time had passed and Mike decided to turn to his assistant. He asked if she could hear him, and if she could show up at this moment to get a new assignment. As usual, she showed up the second she did and asked what her wishes would be this time. She is fully prepared to do her job, but for now, the girl has no idea what awaits her. As suddenly Mike took her hand, which means he's about to say something really special. It turns out he just decided to ask her to go with him, but he didn't explain where or why. So after a while, they ended up in the same place outside of town. But that's not the best part. On the way here, the guy didn't even realize that when they got to this place. Of this building, they won't see it, which is very surprising because he knows for a fact that he's been here, and he certainly hasn't gotten the wrong road. He started to have a lot of questions, and even a suggestion that maybe after the game, this building is moved to another location so that no outsiders can come in here and prevent the game from being played here. He began to look around very carefully, but unfortunately they didn't find anything. After a while, the girl also started to look into the case, and quite by accident, she felt something. In her opinion, there's definitely something hiding here, and maybe they just need to keep looking, because there's no way that a huge building just disappears. They even had the thought of going back to avoid making another mistake, but Mike, unsurprisingly, didn't want to give up so easily, and decided to stay after all. His aides began to remind him that if they didn't know something and weren't confident in their abilities, it was better not to take any chances and go back home. As a result, they never reached a common ground, because his desire to figure things out trumps any fear and desire to go back out there. But just a few minutes later, the girl persuaded him to go back again. For to begin with, it would be a good idea to come up with a few plans so that there would be no surprises or stalemates as a result. And then, Mike came up with a very interesting option that might help them see what he didn't see during the game in real life. He suggested they play the game, but not in real life, but with their phones. It's kind of an experiment for them, whereby they won't need to spread out in a huge abandoned building in the dark. They had agreed in advance to be as careful as possible not to miss anything. For some reason, they've been in this room for 24 hours, but for some reason, nothing happens. After waiting so long, they even got the idea that maybe this game doesn't work anymore and they won't succeed. At this point, the guy asked his assistant why his life expectancy hasn't increased lately, to which the girl replied that so far, no one reads his stories and doesn't want to take revenge on anyone. And since the number of visits to their site depends on the longevity of its life, with this also need to think of something to do. How suddenly, when they had just started talking about their problems, each of them noticed something suspicious. All simultaneously began to stare at the same point and watch intently for what would happen next. At this point, they have absolutely no idea what to do in this situation or whether there is any danger to either of them. For some reason, the front door to this room began to glow red, as if inviting me to see what was behind it. In that room, all three of them felt some strange energy that caused a sense of dread. When suddenly, as they were sitting in their seats and looking at this door, the handle of this door began to move, and it was as if someone was opening the door from the other side. They looked at each other and realized that there was clearly something behind her, and thought how good it was that they didn't go up to her and check something out. After that, the door opened even more. They had a misunderstanding of what they should do in this situation. As suddenly, they saw the hand of some monster slowly start to enter the room, which means that by the looks of it, the game has begun. The creature starts talking to them and tells them it's the first player's turn. Since the girl is the first player, she got up from the couch, and at that moment, Mike started watching her very closely. How suddenly, as soon as the girl stood in the middle of the room, it was obvious that she was no longer in control of her body, and something had begun to control her. It was very hard and unpleasant for the players to watch everything that was going on, because it causes nothing but fear and the desire to stop this game. But since it could no longer be stopped and paused, they just had to watch what was happening and keep a close eye on the number one player. Meanwhile, they began to feel some unknown energy in the room that was trying to make them want to play this game as long as possible. But this time, Mike noticed that it was much easier for him to be here and play this game, unlike how it was the other day. So when they saw what was going to happen to them next, they had the urge to cancel the game, because everything looks so scary that it's just impossible to watch. After a while, Mike heard his assistant's voice. She was trying very hard to find the strength to tell him something. Unfortunately, she was able to say something, but it was so quiet that the guy didn't know what she meant. Either way, he truly believed in her and knew that she was definitely going to be okay, because that's what mattered most. As suddenly, she managed to find her strength after all, and the girl was able to explain that if he said his name, only then would she be able to get rid of this monster. And if she doesn't, it's going to be very hard for her to even go back and start controlling herself. To which the guy replied that if she still had any strength left, it would be a good idea to continue the game and follow the rules, because that was the only way they could find out everything they wanted to know. Looking at the first player, Mike is trying his best to watch as closely as possible and figure out what the game is trying to do at this point to hurt each of them. As suddenly, this creature that is in the room with them and controlling the game notices the little monster behind its master's back and looks at it very closely. The guy notices this and starts thinking about what the creature's next move will be. And also, he's very interested to see if there will be any differences between the players when it's their turn. Like suddenly, it's player number 2's turn, namely, the little monster. In his master's opinion, he should do well, for he is also as strong as all of them. The little monster is trying his best to destroy his opponent, and so far, he's doing better than the number 1 player. His master begins to admire it, because it is amazing and very interesting to watch how a small creature is not afraid of anything and is determined to fulfill the task of his master. He really has a lot of motivation, which makes Mike very happy, because to have such helpers, it's a great happiness for him. But at some point, his opponent suddenly came from behind and struck a very hard blow. It was very unpleasant and made him even more eager to take revenge on him for all that he had done. After this, the little monster is really pissed off and knows exactly what he's about to do in response. He suddenly grew even bigger and changed his appearance, much to the surprise of his opponent. Taking advantage of this situation where he became very large, the monster moved even closer to his opponent to strike again. The monster has a lot of hands, as well as much more strength, which allows you to take revenge and show who will be the winner. The little monster who became a big monster really turned out to be very much and absolutely no longer afraid of anyone. He's pretty good at destroying the enemy, which makes Mike very happy. How all of a sudden he even managed to eat this monster, which is really quite amazing. The girl and the guy look at everything that is happening and just cannot believe their eyes, because it is really impressive and very unexpected, especially from such a small monster as he was before that. He really exceeded his owner's expectations and showed what he is capable of. If someone believes in him and he feels someone's support, it's really important for him. The owner was very worried about him in the beginning, but as it turned out, it was not necessary, apparently. He was really underestimated. But now, it is clear to everyone that despite his height, he is very strong. After this, the lad began leafing through his book and hoped very much that he would see some clue in it. It turns out this game purposely erases other people's memories of the players, and maybe that's why Mike still can't remember certain things. After a while, the lad faintly heard some knocking at the door, though it was very strange, for he was not expecting anyone, and he does not know who it could be. Mike asked the man what the reason was for coming here, to which the man replied that he had just heard some strange noises, and so wanted to know if everything was okay. In the guy's opinion, he shouldn't trust this person, because maybe it's part of the game, and there's someone behind the door who might try to hurt him again. So he walked leisurely to the door and decided to see who was behind it. And surprisingly, there was a man standing there who said he was a neighbor and he said he'd been here recently. After that, Mike decided to open the door and say hello to the man after all, hoping it wouldn't be another mistake and deception on the man's part. They greeted each other, and after that, there was an awkward pause, for no one realized what they could talk about. Before he left, this man gave the guy some food and said it was delicious, although from the outside, it looked like he was trying to poison him. Anyway, we can only hope that the guy realizes this and doesn't try this food because it really can be dangerous. After that, he said goodbye to the man and realized he was already very much in the mood for a vacation. He didn't even look at the contents of the bag because it was of no interest to him at all. But before he left to rest, Mike asked if his assistants wanted to try the food. And of course, their answer is absolutely obvious. No one wants to risk trying food from some stranger. They left this bag in the corner and thought about getting rid of it the next day. Meanwhile, a woman from a special department came to her director to report what she thought were successful results of her work, to which the man replied that she had done very well as always. But before the woman started to leave, he asked her to stay behind to find out a few things. Turns out he wanted to ask the Special Victims Unit something, and apparently it's really important. The woman starts to ask what he wanted to ask the special department and how she can help him in this situation because apparently he has some problems. After a while, he did decide to explain to her what was wrong, and from the looks of it, he would rather not do that and tell her his problem. It turns out he does have an unpleasant situation that requires him to find out some information, namely whether he has children. To which the woman replied that this request looks like some kind of a joke. Apparently, she really doesn't realize that everything is much more serious than it seems to be. The man apologized for this request and decided to explain that every day he was haunted by some strange sensations and was already very tired. The woman began to listen intently to his problem and tried to give him an opportunity so that he could give all the details. The man said that he and his wife don't have children yet, but he was confused about something very strange, namely how they got a room for a teenager in their home. At first, he had long thought that they had prepared a room for their future children, but lately, this room didn't look at all like one made for a small child. He really got the feeling that someone was living in this room, as it was constantly filled with some magazines, a computer, and clothes fit for a teenage boy. This is a very strange situation, which really cannot be ignored, and now it is clear why the man turned to a woman, because independently in this is simply impossible to understand. He needs the help of professionals. In the meantime, Mike decided to go for a walk and get some fresh air. It's beautiful weather outside, and it's a great excuse to get outside and experience the atmosphere. At which point, he suddenly gets some kind of message on his phone that's a warning. Someone wrote to him that it was quite dangerous there, which is very strange because he didn't ask anyone anything or have any interest in something like that. But after playing the game, he stopped taking the word danger, because after that, he's not afraid of anything. Just as the lad began to wonder who was trying to warn him of the danger, he didn't notice at all that he was approached by some people who wanted to ask him something. And it turns out they were the same people from the special department who were interested in taking down his site and everything related to it. They showed him their IDs and asked him to stay with them to talk about something very important. But judging by their mood, they were not in the mood for a nice conversation, but rather the opposite. Apparently, the message that had just arrived on his phone had warned him of just that, and as it turned out, he really should have paid attention to it. Mike certainly wasn't prepared to meet these people and doesn't know at all how best to behave in this situation, because if he says the wrong thing, it could cause a lot of problems. For starters, one of the assistants asked him if he knew a certain person. This guy tried to scare Mike, but he doesn't even realize it's for nothing. The guy replied that he knew this man, in fact, to communicate with him several times, to which the woman asked if he could take them instead of where all these people disappeared to. And then, someone suggested we talk about it at home, because to discuss the subject in the street, a lot of people might hear the conversation, which could cause gossip. At this point, the guy tried to think of some plan to avoid getting himself in a lot of trouble and becoming another suspect. It's really important to him, because if someone starts to suspect him and takes down the site, his life depends on it. After that, he offered them to go to his house and put conditions that if they did not agree to this, he would not talk to them and would not tell them anything. And after that, the guy asked them to give him an official document that confirms his truancy from school. It was starting to stir up some negative emotions in some of the special victims unit, but I guess that was the plan. According to the woman, this guy is really very mysterious, because despite the fact that they approached him very unexpectedly, he looks quite confident and is not nervous at all. But that's not all. The woman after some time felt that he was emanating some special energy, which is probably very different from the energy of a normal person, but in any case, she could not prove it. Meanwhile, they've already reached the elevator. The guy talks to them well enough and tries not to give the appearance that he's very worried and doesn't know how to behave in this situation. He tries to be as benevolent as possible because a lot depends on it, and it is impossible to make a mistake. As soon as they entered his apartment, the guy warned that he would tell everything he knew. But first, he would like to ask them to answer some questions, to which the woman agreed, which was very surprising. He must have wanted to ask them these questions for no reason, and it might actually make some sense. It's very interesting to see what he's up to and what that plan is. He's probably going to kill these questions for more than just talking to these people. For starters, he's already come up with the first question they'll have to answer, and it turns out it's a pretty tough one, if they have anything to hide, of course. The question was whether they were trying to deceive him when they said they were not from the department from which they were emerging. And judging by the reactions of these people, it was quite obvious to him that they had tried to keep this information from him and didn't expect him to know much more about them than they thought they did. They're really surprised and didn't expect him to know that information at all. So, he warned each of them that if they allowed themselves to withhold important information from him, he had the right to do so as well. And of course, his words made these people very angry because nobody expected him to be such a smart guy. At some point, because of surprise and anger, one of them accidentally broke a very expensive glass. The guy made a remark and said that it was very rude of them because he had invited them to visit. And they dared him to not only cheat, but to smash his personal belongings. Thus, he's doing a pretty good job of being in charge of this conversation.